Thank you, Alicia. Thanks for the opportunity to participate today. I'm such a big believer in the mission of the Autism Science Foundation, so grateful for all you have done for the field, and it's really an honor to be able to contribute to the Day of Learning today. So I was asked to talk about what autism research should try to accomplish in the next 10 years, which I find kind of a daunting topic, because how could you fill 12 minutes with that topic? And what I thought, okay, how could I tackle this? So maybe instead of thinking that about everything that autism research should do in 10 years, that can never fit in 12 minutes, but what if I thought about what autism research shouldn't focus on the next 10 years, right? That would be more manageable. And what I'm gonna make it might sound provocative, but I'm gonna explain to you what I mean. What I'm thinking that we might do in the next 10 years to actually make more progress than we've made in the past is stop trying to understand autism. Stop trying to study autism. And let me tell you what I mean by that. So there are many, many different ways that we can apply science to understand autism. And I'm going to talk to you today just from the perspective of some of the things, the spheres in which I exist, the things that I know something about. And these are clinical psychology. So as a clinical psychologist, I work with families, I diagnose autism, I think about what can be done to be helpful. In that capacity, I also think a lot about what autism means for people, what it means as an identity for an autistic person, what it means for a parent to think of their child as having autism. I also think about autism as a neuroscientist, as a person who tries to understand how the brain works and how that might give us information that's useful in autism. And then the last sphere I'll talk about is as a person who measures behavior, who thinks about what are ways that we can really objectively measure all the different things that we think of are a part of autism in ways that could be useful. And I spent a lot of time trying to think about how all these things go together. And I think there are some places where thinking about autism works really well. I think as a clinician, it works pretty well to say to another clinician, oh, this is a person with autism. It tells them some things to expect. Not everything, but it tells them some things to expect. I think it can also work as something of meaning to a person, to a family, to say, oh, this is autism. I think that it fails us as neuroscientists and as people who measure behavior. And let me give you some very, very specific examples why. So let's start with neuroscience. So if I were to try to describe what it means to study autism as a neuroscientist, how could I do that? Like, one thing that I could do, and I say I, but that's being too generous with me, a wonderful postdoc named Jason Griffin. What could Jason do? Well, he could look at some of the recent review articles that have been published and think about every brain region that seems to be involved in autism. And if you were to do that, this is what it looks like. So 44 different brain regions, pretty much the whole brain, all over the place. I think that that's complicated, and I think it's going to be hard for us to draw really meaningful, practical inferences when we try to think about all these things at once. Okay, what about behavior? Like, if we're trying to measure behavior, how could we think about that? So what I did here is I just looked, all right, let's take the actual definition of autism. Let's go to the DSM-5. And I didn't even look at the 5,000-word narrative description. I just took the 300 words and 7 billets that are checkboxes to diagnose autism, right? And when I looked in there, just in those 300 words, I found 69 different things that I could measure, right? So lots and lots of things. And I think we have the same problem. This is really complicated, lots and lots. What do we get when we try to take all these 69 quantifiable behaviors and relate them to all those 44 different brain regions, right? Everything, everywhere, all at once. And I think that we're not going to get anywhere fast with that kind of approach. So what could we do? Well, what if we just did, instead of thinking autism, what if we thought about something that is maybe more discrete, measurable, meaningful, but yet super relevant to autism? Like, what if we just said, let's think about what of these behaviors are related to, say, perceiving another person or perceiving a person's face? So then our 69 goes down to 2, which I think is more manageable. If we think about our brain regions, if we say, okay, well, what brain regions would we think to be involved specifically in perceiving another person or face perception? Well, then we dramatically reduce it, right? We have just a handful of brain regions involved in this. Now, this sounds so, I hope this sounds intuitive, but this is a mistake that we make again and again and again as a field. And let me give you an example from a study that I'm very involved with, the Autism Biomarkers Consortium for Clinical Trials, which is a big study. It has I mean, there are multiple people who will speak here today who have had input into the design of this scientific study. And despite all this expertise, what did we do when we thought, okay, we want to understand how brain activity maps onto the things that maybe matter in autism? We did everything everywhere all at once. So we thought, okay, we're going to take, we actually narrowed down brain region. We used a specific kind of brain response, right? So what you see there on the horizontal axis is how fast a person's brain responds to seeing a face. And this is something that's very well studied in autism. And we found, of course, many, many studies over 2 decades now, is that the brain response is slower in autism. And then what you see on the vertical axis is autism, with a really good, reliable measure called the social responsiveness scale. And each one of those dots is one of the 280 kids who participated in the study. And if you try to look at that cloud of dots and you try to find a meaningful relationship, you're not going to find one. So the relationship between autism in all its forms and brain response, this brain response is almost zero. What if we try to think about it in a more discrete way? What if we narrow it down really to something specific that is intuitively related to these brain regions, that is measurable and simpler? What if we just looked at, say, for example, the ability to actually recognize a face? Well, now, in this chart, you're seeing the same thing on the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, you're seeing a person's ability to recognize faces measured with a standard psychological assessment called the NEPSI. And now, when we look at the relationship between these two things, we see a meaningful relationship, right? So we've gone from everything everywhere all at once to actually some kind of relationship between a brain system and a behavior that we think is relevant to understanding autism. So how might we do this? So this is a principle, but what are some of the things that we could do? And I don't think they're that complicated. One is really easy. We have many really well-studied, robustly designed instruments to characterize autism as a whole thing. But there are very few that are as well-designed, well-studied, built to measure very specific aspects of autism. Let me give you a very concrete example. I'm very interested in social drive, and there's not a good measure that I can just use to measure a person's social motivation, for example. So one thing we could do is change the kind of instruments that we create. Another thing that we could do is think differently about the instruments that we already have. And I want to highlight some of the work here of Mirko Uljerevic, who I actually, believe it or not, I actually emailed him and I had him send me an audio file with the pronunciation of his name, and I ruined it anyway. But Mirko, is doing a nice job using big existing data sets of the field standard kind of comprehensive autism measurements, and then using sophisticated analytic methods to try to find more granular subscales within them. So we can actually use the information we have and just think about it differently. And then what do I think that would give us in terms of potential benefits? So one would be an understanding of mechanism. One of the things that we as autism scientists have not made great strides in doing is really understanding what's happening that leads to the things that we see in autism. And we call those mechanisms. And an example is what I showed you. Understanding that how fast your brain responds to a face is going to tell you something about how good you are at recognizing faces, right? That's something mechanistic. I think when we start thinking about things in this more granular way, we're more likely to find mechanism. Two, so nicely illustrated by Dr. Martin's talk, is I think that when we think about things like this, it really opens the door to have greater success using animal models of autism research. You've heard so many times, mice don't have autism. No, they don't. But as we saw, mice touch, they hear, right? So if we think about things in sub-processes that are actually more mappable, that are relevant to autism but mappable to other species, we might learn more things. And then lastly, when we stop thinking about autism as a specific category, but start thinking about some of these processes, we actually, I think, have more leverage to understand autism because we could study it across conditions. The kinds of things that we're interested in autism, like what I showed you, face perception, that's affected in anxiety, it's affected in schizophrenia spectrum disorders. So if we look at variants across lots and lots and lots of groups of people, we could understand more about how the brain works in ways that are very specifically relevant to autism. So these are all kind of scientific benefits, but I also think that there are potentially specific clinical benefits that could be advanced in the short term with this kind of approach. One is thinking about medications. How many journal articles start that there is no medication to treat the core features of autism? Well, maybe there won't be. Maybe we should be thinking about things that are specifically beneficial. And again, Dr. Martin gave a great example. Maybe we should be thinking about a medication that doesn't treat autism, but treats a certain form of sensory hypersensitivity or treats anxiety or things like that. I think it also, thinking about it this way, also opens the door for other kinds of ways of intervening that are really underutilized in autism presently. So this is an image of transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is just a way of using magnets to basically juice up parts of the brain. And this is an FDA-approved treatment for things that are really relevant to autism, like depression. But it's hardly been studied at all in autism. And I think part of the reason is because how do you use that to target the whole brain in those 44 regions? But if you're thinking about specific neural systems, then we open the door to applying approaches like this that I think that could be impactful. So just to end where I began, we have this concept of autism that is so scoping that I think it works in some places, and I think it's really a challenge to get it to use the tools we have in neuroscience and the tools we have in behavior measurement to really understand it in meaningful ways. And I think that maybe if we stop trying to do that and start thinking about it in more specific and granular ways, we can make progress in all of these areas. And I just want to end by acknowledging the group of people, many of you who are volunteering here today in the lab, who've helped me think about these ideas and have helped me put together some of the figures for today. So thank you.
I have a question for you, Dr. McPartland. How could research improve autism with the right medication or the right advocacy for medication from parents and doctors?
Sure, I think lots of ways. I think that one would be the example I gave before, right? Feeling depressed or feeling anxious is something that affects many, many people with autism, people without autism. And there are medications that exist that target those systems, that target those kinds of symptoms. And I think thinking more carefully about the way that we can use medication to treat specific features could be an inroads.
I love the presentation, and I feel like you're talking a lot about the how, but I think a lot about the who. And so when you think about how people across the spectrum experience things, I'm wondering about participants in these studies, and I'm thinking specifically about those that are more profoundly affected. How does that work? Do you feel like these findings are applicable across the spectrum, or when you think about the who and how we can help those who are profoundly affected, do you think that's applicable?
I do, and to be clear, when I talk about these ideas, I'm not intending to speak to any particular segment of the population, people with autism. In the neuroscience studies we do in the lab, we include people who across, we actually have a very specific line of research where we only invite people with profound autism to participate. So I do think it's relevant, and I think that when we think about, I think the way that I would apply these principles to thinking about profound autism is not thinking about the words, but thinking about what are the things that we would measure that are relevant in profound autism, and then these same principles apply, right? So maybe it's the things underlying aggression or self-injury or cognitive ability, for example, right? I think I actually think this kind of approach could help us find more meaningful ways to conduct research in a consistent way across all these different segments of the autism spectrum in a way that right now I think we struggle sometimes.
Hi, Dr. McPartland. Thank you for your excellent presentation. I have a question just kind of on the basic sphere of autism research. Historically, outcome measures in scientific studies have been somewhat limited and subjective, maybe not measuring function or showing meaningful change in function. And I'm just wondering what your opinion would be on the direction we need to go with outcome measures for basic science research for the community in the next 10 years. And I'm sorry if that's a super loaded question, but I'd be interested to hear your opinion.
If it's loaded, I'm too obtuse to pick up on the nuance, so I'll just answer it as if it weren't a loaded question. I think that, again, well, one, I think that we're more likely to find things that are meaningful. Like, again, to kind of make the point I said before, what would it mean even for autism symptoms to be an outcome measure, right? Like, what changed? Was it a sensory symptom? Was it a social symptom? Was it a language system? And so I think thinking in this granular way is more useful for there. I think also that but maybe this is the loaded part. I think what's important is thinking about how for me as a clinical psychologist, the most important outcome is quality of life. Right? And that could be measured in lots of different ways, right? It could be measured in a person's edification in their life. It could be measured in a parent's experience of raising a child. It could be measured with objective things like employability or ability to live independently or medical health. So I think those are the kinds of things that are most important, in my opinion.
So, a question that I've gotten, or a criticism that I've gotten from members of the community is that too much of the research over the last 10, 20 years has been focused too much on basic science and answering questions that are too distal from actually helping people live their daily lives. And so the question for you is, in focusing research priorities over the next 10 years, how much should be focused on working on this basic mechanistic understanding of autism versus improving services and supports in the here and now for people who can benefit more proximally?
Well, I don't think they're two different things, Zach. I think that, Alicia made the comment, that I'm a clinical psychologist and I've helped people. I hope so. It's something that's important to me because the research that we do, I published a study on the brain bases of face perception. I understand that has made nobody's life better today, right? One of the things I like is that as a clinician, if I'm doing my job well, I can make somebody's life better today. What I believe as a scientist and a clinician is that the insights that we gain through basic science research can make far more scoping advances that benefit many more people. If all I did was clinical work for the rest of my life, I could help a very finite amount of people. If I made a scientific discovery that changed the way that every other clinician could do their job, I could improve things for millions of people. And that, to me, is the point of doing basic research.
Hi. Is this on? Yeah, hi. You talked about medications, for example, to reduce anxiety. And my concern is about what's causing the anxiety rather than just reducing it, because that's just covering it up. One example that I see in my experience with about 50 young women is that anxiety is caused by the lack of understanding somebody else's perspective. Is there research on how to address that? I know that's referred to as theory of mind, but that is a huge stumbling block for some of the most capable of people with autism. So I'm just wondering, rather than just medicate the anxiety, can we look at ways to reduce the anxiety by changing the way people are thinking?
Sure, and I totally agree with you. I hope it didn't sound like I was implying otherwise. I think a reality that we face as clinical psychologists in autism and otherwise is finding the source and improving the source of the anxiety isn't intuitively appealing, but really challenging kind of goal, right? And some of these things aren't even like psychological fixes. Some of them could be things that are hardwired, right? Like if my nervous system is built just differently, right? The end result of that might be anxiety. And so what would be the way to address, using the medication might actually be the way to address the source of the anxiety for some people. And you give a very specific example. If you have anxiety deriving from the difficulty you experience navigating social interactions, for sure. There's lots of people studying that. I think it's been a big push in autism for many years. I think one of the new pushes, one of the new strategies that people have taken is not change the experience of the interaction for the person with autism, but also try to make it easier for the people around them, maybe have a little more understanding about it. But I agree with you entirely in principle, and I don't see the idea, we can do both. And I would presume as a clinical psychologist for the foreseeable future, our ability to eradicate sources of anxiety, we might not want to eradicate the sources of anxiety, right? I worry about lots and lots of things. And in my experience of being me, I feel like, like staying up all night and worrying about this talk probably helped me give a better talk, right? And if I had been so chill that I was sleeping through the night, maybe I can't speak for you, maybe the talk wasn't good, but maybe it would have been a lot worse if I had been sleeping instead of thinking in my bed. Thank you so much.